Get started. Welcome everyone to this last session of Book Talk. We will begin again in the fall when it's a little bit cooler and we can think more clearly. I am very happy to welcome Corinna, we have a Corinna, but this is a Corinna Zeltsman, to this last session of Book Talk. Corinna has had a long association with CBA, starting in 2002 when she was a summer intern. And she returned in 2006 with a fellowship to study the book arts. And she also worked in the office as an administrator for 2.5 years. And when she returned in 2006, I used to tease her and tell her that now she was all grown up. So I don't know what I say now. Her study of printing and binding during the time she was at the center have informed the research she has gone on to do. Corinna got her PhD in Latin American history from Duke, and this book, Ink Under the Fingernails, Printing Politics in 19th-Century Mexico, is a result of her doctoral research. We will put the link for the book in the chat, and there also is a discount code if you would like to purchase it. Corinna is now an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University. She is a senior fellow in the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Biography at Rare Book School. I am so pleased to have her back with us tonight. And after her talk, we'll have a Q&A. So if you want to put your questions in the chat as we go along, I can read them at the end. And since we don't have so many people, we can invite you to unmute yourself and ask your questions yourself. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Corinna. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. And thanks everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to be able to share this research with you all. I see there's a mix of folks in the room, folks from many stages of my life, and also folks that I hope I'll get to meet in person one day. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. I want to thank in particular Ronnie for this invitation, and also Jenna for helping to set everything up. It's really great to be here, and all of you in the sweaty Northeast and parts otherwise for being here. So I'm going to be speaking today about the book, this new book, which explores how printers shaped broad debates about press freedom and authorship in 19th century Mexico. So I'll talk a little bit about the origins of the project and why it's important to study this history in Mexico. And then I'll talk a little bit about the give you a little bit of historical context and highlight some of the themes of the book. But since a lot of us are practitioners, right, this is an audience of practitioners and folks interested in the kind of practical dimensions of books and printing, and I want to really try to bring people into a 19th century Mexican printing shop to look at some of the political dynamics and social aspirations that flourished there. Kind of give you a slice of the research project to think about those themes. So, you know, as Ronnie said, this is really a project that's connected to the Center for Book Arts. And after I had the good fortune to stumble into the world of printing through this summer internship, I returned as an undergraduate to study and fell also into Latin American studies because of my interest in language. And so I sort of pursued those two interests at the same time. And when I returned to the center in 2006, I was really coming back around over and over again to the question of where Latin America fit, you know, into these narratives of printing history that I was encountering. And I wasn't really seeing this in the institutions that I interacted with. So that question kind of drove me as I went back to pursue a degree in history. And you know, of all the places I could have chosen to work on, Latin America is a very big, large, diverse region. So Mexico, though, really stood out as a good site to pursue this research question, and in particular Mexico City, because as some of you may know, it's the site of the oldest printing tradition in the Western Hemisphere. And yet there are no monographic studies about Mexico's printing trades published in English. There's a lot of scholarship, a flourishing scholarly community that works on these topics in Spanish based in Latin America. But in the US, the absence of this kind of interest has really fed into narratives that privilege the United States as a kind of inheritor of the European printing tradition, and minimizes the multiple trajectories of print in the Americas. So what I see my work as doing is contributing to efforts to really pluralize our understanding of the multiple trajectories of printing. So to give you a little bit of context, the printing press was introduced in Mexico in 1539 as part of a project of colonization and evangelization. It became really central to colonial governance. And on the right, you can see an example of a printed decree of the kind that would have been used to promulgate directives or laws. And it was also, printing was really central to the creation of intellectual communities, intellectual life in Mexico, as well as the creation of popular religious cultures. On the left, you can see an example of, from a prayer book, a kind of more affordable item that would have circulated, forming part of a kind of Catholic religious culture. So it's important to understand the geographies of printing in colonial Mexico because they really reveal a lot about the political and economic context in which printers worked. Mexico was really the unrivaled center of publishing in the Spanish Americas throughout the colonial era. It was the capital city in Mexico. It was a hub of power and wealth, and printing shops really clustered in the central core, very close to the halls of power. And you can see in red here, this is a 19th century map, but the buildings are still in the same place. The cathedral, the national, what is now the National Palace, was then the Viceregal Palace, and municipal government. And anyone who wanted to publish needed approval from religious and royal officials, right? And the church and the state were also really important patrons or customers, right, of printers. So there's this system around printing that really emphasizes consensus and collaboration. And the map is as I said, a 19th century map, gives you a sense of how printing shops continued to cluster right in the downtown near these official spaces, even after independence. So after colonial rule collapses, these little X's give you a sense of where all of these printing shops continued to stay in the 19th century, right in the downtown. And colonial printers, like the one that you see depicted here, highlighted those close connections to royal and religious patrons, right? This is a portrait of the printer Manuel Antonio Valdez, commissioned by his son, in which he is described as the royal printer to His Majesty, which was this special title that he was given by the king and reflected his special privileges and connections to the powerful officials. So he actually, in this portrait, there's this sort of performance of loyalty in a context where printers really depended on official patronage in order to sustain their businesses. So all of this changes after Mexico achieved its independence in 1821, and this is really where the meat of the project lies, where things really get good. Independence brought really sweeping changes to the world of printing. Mexican officials embraced Republican forms of government, so they ratified a constitution, and they established freedom of the press as these new liberal concepts. And all of these political factions that began to emerge after independence seized upon printing, broadsides, pamphlets, newspapers in the struggle for power, right? And so these printed items became components, weapons in this battle on this terrain, which I call printing politics, this sort of political debates that took place through the space of print. And for for officials and for intellectuals who were trying to build a new nation, printing gained this new symbolic importance. People looked to it as this transformative technology that could be used for all sorts of things, to shape public opinion, to provide a kind of check against too much state power, right, a kind of balance against tyranny, or to educate the nation that had been a nation that was largely deprived of formal schooling. So in the eyes of lawmakers, the press could serve and this is a quote, to spread the seed of virtue to all corners, establish the principles of justice, and make nations happy with the immense benefits of civilization. So there's this hope associated with printing as this technology that can be used to affect massive scale social, political, civilizational change. Now, anyone who wanted to actually use the press had to confront what I call the politics of printing, right? Which is the gritty pragmatics of actually running a printing business in 19th century Mexico. And this was not an easy thing. The wars of independence had essentially destroyed Mexico's economy, and there was only a small minority of Mexicans who could actually afford to pay for printed materials like newspaper subscriptions or political pamphlets. And printers, on top of this, had to pay out really large sums in advance to acquire equipment and supplies from abroad. Things like presses, paper, and type were all very expensive and were all imported into Mexico. So this was a pretty challenging environment. And within this environment, printers emerged as these semi-autonomous political figures who really sustain their businesses through a mix of strategies, a kind of opaque mixture. It's hard to tell exactly how, through political patronage, through private commissions, and also through their own kind of independent editorial ventures. And they became these really important facilitators of this emerging world of political debate. And as such, they were often criticized and sometimes viewed with scorn by their social superiors, by political elites who dismissed them as essentially uneducated and therefore unqualified to be full participants in this emerging public sphere of political debate. And there are these negative judgments that emerge about printers in these dual characterizations. On the one hand, printers are described as partisan hacks, people who will print who will only print basically what their political associations tell them to print, or as unprincipled mercenaries who will print anything for a profit. So the sort of rock and hard place characterizations of printers emerge that reflect these kind of negative judgments of their activities. All of Mexico's independent governments embraced the liberal guarantee of press freedom, regardless of where they fell on the political spectrum, but their rhetorical commitment existed in tension with these constant efforts to tame and channel this world of printing politics. And they did this through crackdowns on the communities who were associated with printing, and also through regulations on printed expression that tried to hold printers legally responsible for any controversial texts that they produced. And actually, that's one of the threads I follow through the book, the question of responsibility. Who's responsible for a text? Authors, printers, publishers, what kind of, who assumes legal responsibility at the end of the day? And actually, one of the central arguments of the book is that we really can't understand the history of press freedom without taking into account its laboring and material dimensions, because lawmakers were constantly trying to control printing as part of their ongoing efforts to make limits, or workable limits, around public speech throughout the 19th century. And printers, in response, became these legal theorists who argued that you couldn't have press freedom unless you also had freedom for printers. So they played this really important role in articulating a kind of legal argument about the status of printers in relation to press freedom. And the book traces these negotiations as they unfolded among printers, between printers and officials, from the independence era all the way to the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And the new revolutionary constitution brings a whole new set of issues to the printing trades. Kind of a mixed results as a result of these debates. So the stakes of all of these conflicts and debates were pretty high. Government officials and political elites were worried that if you let print work in an unregulated fashion, right? Unregulated printing would provoke political unrest, it would undermine morality, and it would erode the very foundations of the social order. And this painting that I've reproduced here attests to the anxieties of elites through a scene of tavern reading. And what you have here is, it's called tertulia de pulqueria. It's folks hanging out in a pulqueria, which is a drinking establishment where you consume pulque, this beverage in the center of the table. They're all sitting around reading political imprints that actually circulated in 19th century Mexico. They're bearded and cloaked. These are members of the popular classes. They're sort of assembled around. Here, this figure is decoding a cartoon for people who presumably can't read. And you have mixed company, right? People drinking together, carousing, making fun of political imprints and things. And a painting like this would have hung in the house of elite patrons who could observe this social scene from a safe distance and draw conclusions about the potential dangers of print out of place, right? You've got drinking, politics, the popular classes all mingling together, and this is hardly the kind of population that you want participating in politics. So people elites would have drawn conclusions about an image like this, it would have fed into their attempts to regulate this world, right? Either by restricting who could vote or by regulating printing more carefully. But we can also kind of we can do a counter reading of this image, because you can see the way it proposes everyday life as a kind of democratizing arena where print meets unanticipated audiences and generates conversations and discussion through these real intimate networks of exchange. So I think that printing really refracts the fears, but also the hopes of a cross-section of society. So social ferment and contestation also churn behind the scenes of literate production. Now I'm getting us closer to the printing shop. And these were spaces that hosted a wide range of actors with diverse levels of education and skill, whose activities really blurred the boundaries between manual and intellectual labors. Across differences in job type and education, printing shop inhabitants shared aspirations and actually competed for social status via the printed word. You had printing shop owners who struggled to gain access and respect in a world that was dominated by elites who really disdained manual labor. Printers also had to contend with lawmakers who really thought that they should act as mute extensions of their presses and allow the voice of educated authors to flow right through the printed word. Journalists worked in printing shops and they had access to a kind of public literary voice, but they always complained about the directives. They had to follow the directions of the print shop owners who paid what were notoriously low wages. And printing shop workers, especially type compositors, dreamed about having their own voices reproduced on the printed page. And this satirical representation that you see here of a Mexico City type compositor, El Cajista, pokes fun at the type compositor's dream by depicting El Cajista as this social climbing, working class dandy. He's wearing a top hat on the job and tight pants. He's kind of trying to look like a gentleman even as he's working. He's like a working class figure. And his typos bring about the downfall of respectable society. There's this accompanying textual vignette that goes along with the image that describes the way that he is daydreaming on the job, thinking about a better life, thinking about his girlfriend. And in the process, he performs a series of typos that turn a social announcement into a funeral announcement. Literally, he kills off members of respectable society. So the vignette really depicts the typesetter and his social aspirations as destabilizing, right? Threatening to the social order. So printing shop work was really collaborative by nature, but it was also shaped by social hierarchies, tensions, and also aspirations. Now, printers challenged the assumption that their associations with manual labor disqualified them as thinkers. And indeed, one of the things I argue in the book is that we really should consider them as a particular category of intellectuals who intervened in broader political and cultural debates precisely because of their unique working relationship to words. The owners of printing businesses were really visible participants in legal debates about press freedom, but they were also intervening in conversations about literary taste, politics, and national identity as publishers. They sort of double as publishers across the 19th century. And type compositors were also part of these conversations. They embraced elements of liberal discourse across the 19th century. They celebrated education and hard work as avenues for self-improvement. And they really rarely had a chance to assume that public voice in print, but they seized special opportunities whenever they could to display their knowledge and ideas. Like a religious celebration. On the left, I have this wonderful concrete poem from the 1820s created in honor of the Virgin, but which displays the typesetters' mastery of language, but also their skill, right, in creating these organic forms through composition. In the middle, this is a poem that was created by printers, by typesetters in honor of their boss's birthday, right? So a special occasion could be an opportunity to show your literary chops. And they were also leading voices in the urban worker press, which sprang up in the 1870s. On the right, you see an issue of a newspaper, and these worker newspapers, printers had this outsized presence as essentially journalists in the worker press. So one of my book's contributions is to explore the ways that printers really claimed textual production for themselves. And they elaborated these creative and really craft-inflected formulations that demanded recognition for their intellectual activities. It was really common in the 19th century for writers and journalists to embrace the paradigm of romantic individualism, like the lone author, the creative genius who has autonomy and creative freedom. And this was a way that journalists tried to boost their social status, given that they didn't necessarily have actual economic wealth. But printers, in their own writings, took a different tack, and they reimagined intellectual production as this sort of composite, collaborative activity. So I want to close my presentation by sharing with you one of the most interesting documents that I uncovered in the course of my research, and that's one I think will be of particular interest to this crowd. What you see here is are pages from an unpublished type catalog that was created in 1877 by workers in Mexico's national government printing shop. And I want to tell you a little bit about the government printing shop just to kind of orient you to this space out of which this document comes. The government printing shop was located in Mexico City, was a really important space of intellectual production in late 19th century Mexico. It was located inside the National Palace, and it was really a hub in the government's efforts to build a liberal nation state, right? In the 1860s, I don't know, how familiar folks are with Mexico's history, but during the Civil War, when the United States was busy with other things, France invaded Mexico, and the French troops of Napoleon III installed the Habsburg monarch Maximilian on a Mexican throne. But after Maximilian's defeat by the Republican troops of Benito Juarez, the government rededicated this printing shop, which had actually been established by Maximilian, and began to use the printing shop to issue this outpouring of materials that were intended to promote national pride, patriotic history, and promote sort of liberal citizenship, as well as economic development. So this whole, the print shop became this hub of intellectual production, issuing all sorts of materials from trade treaties to economic, projects to create infrastructure, scholarly works about geography, political economy, medicine. It issued textbooks, periodicals for children. So it was just like this barrage, this material that was being, was really being produced with intensity in this government print shop. And these were projects that were ongoing in the 1870s, but were temporarily disrupted right before the creation of this document in 1876, when a hero from the anti-French struggle, General Porfirio Diaz, seized power in a coup and replaced all of the printing shop staff with his own people. So he kicked out like the prior directors of the print shop, brought in his own people. There's this whole bureaucratic shuffling that's taking place, and the inevitable accounting that has to come at the end of the shuffling, where the new leaders have to say, what do we have in the print shop? And what's the state of affairs? And out of that bureaucratic shuffling, type compositors produced this document that you see here, and presented it to bureaucratic superiors in a really limited print run. I think, I don't have the exact figures, but one copy I know survives. Maybe they produced a few, but it was really, it's an interesting document, because when we think about printing, we always talk about mass dissemination and diffusion of ideas. But this small circulation encourages us to think about the performative aspects of printing, right? And the way printing can be used in other ways beyond kind of mass dissemination. So this document, this catalog, was ostensibly made to display the type collection of the printing shop. But it presents us, as you can tell, with a lot of content. In content that is made through this wide-ranging group of references to people and places. It includes these aphorisms, witticisms, kind of commentary, and you will probably recognize some of the individuals, right, that are reproduced in this document: Simon Bolivar, Jorge Washington, Gutenberg, heroes of the Italian unification movement, Garibaldi and Mazzini. And what we have here is essentially this catalog, which is a compendium of heroes, right? It's full of famous, illustrious individuals, heroes that are especially associated with politics, but also heroes associated with cultural production, the arts, music, literature. And it's a space that converges living heroes with dead heroes. It has a lot of Mexican heroes, but also in conversation with a few America's heroes and a lot of European heroes as well. And what I did, when I encountered this document eventually, as I was trying to figure out how to analyze it, was to treat it as a kind of map that lets us reconstruct the political and intellectual worldview of the printing shop's anonymous compositors, right, who put this document together. And what it reveals is this community that's very nationalistic. Mexico is very well represented in this referential world, but it's also in some ways, very cosmopolitan. It's very invested in the political struggles associated with the global rise of liberalism as a political philosophy, as a political project, especially in the context of the world of the Romance language speaking regions of France, Italy, and Spain, kind of would have been called the Latin world at the time. And these were contexts where Republican forces were still struggling against the forces of monarchy, or in some cases had recently triumphed over monarchist governments. And the document really establishes Mexico on the cutting edge of liberal victory, right? Mexico as a kind of avant-garde in the liberal struggle, and claims a privileged place for Mexico as a kind of inheritor of the Western. It kind of constructs this imagined Western tradition that dates back to the classical Greek and Roman world. It's a in some ways, very Eurocentric document that puts Mexico into conversation with this sort of European constructed history. As such, it reveals some of the cultural biases of its makers, right? The cultural worldview, it's very Eurocentric, and the people who made this are very much, I think, steeped in this world of literate culture. And so in some ways, they're silent on persistent inequalities that were endemic to Mexican society, especially about race. Racial inequality is sort of a silenced component of this document. But one of the things I wanted, it's also exclusionary in gendered terms. This is, there are only like 3 or 4 women in this whole referential world, which is very much imagined as a sort of space of male heroism, right, which forms the emotive basis for this imagined community. And the document doesn't just place Mexico on the leading edge of liberalism, but it also establishes the compositors, the type compositors, as privileged interpreters within the exclusive world that they constructed through their references. And one of the things I did was interpret the document alongside other writings that were published by printers in the worker press, where the theme of printers' hidden labor and under-recognized contributions to intellectual life really emerge as a central preoccupation. So I want to just take you through one page of this type catalog in particular. The catalog has sort of subtle politicking that goes on through its use of references. And here in the top, you have this Juan Mendez was the interim president of Mexico. Protasio Tagle was the Minister of the Interior, the bureaucratic official in charge of the print shop. And then this statement, which breaks out of the narrative frame to comment on the actual state of the print shop, right? It says that the printing shop of the federal government is in a terrible state. So it's this sort of commentary on how we need resources. We don't have, things are falling apart. Talent is worth more than instruction. Liberty is a common cause. Luther, Calvin, Savonarola, who are these figures associated with religious reform movements. And of course, the Enlightenment phrase, printing is light, right, which evokes the sort of Enlightenment idea. And here, you have this mishmash of references where printers are sort of choosing talent over instruction, which is a way of criticizing, sort of highlighting meritocracy and the ability of the individual to sort of rise above based on their own merits. They're grasping at freedom, right, liberty, and equating printing with enlightenment. They're really casting themselves as a kind of heroes in their own story, right? And I think they're almost kind of equating their efforts with the work of these three reformers, right? Luther, Calvin, and Savonarola, who are questing for better, they're sort of questing for better working conditions in the printing shop, right? By highlighting the kind of poor material conditions of their everyday reality. But I think they're really questing after, at the same time, questing after recognition within this exclusive world that they facilitated through their labors. So sources like this one, which allow us to get closer to the worldview of the printing shop and the perspectives of these anonymous type compositors, reveal the way that printers seized opportunities to engage in literate production in order to reimagine the social order. In these narratives, printers recast their trade as an activity not just of gritty labor, where workers took their cues from educated social superiors, but also as spaces of education and social transformation in their own right. And I think what this shows is the way that printers tried to scrub out the ink from under their fingernails, right, in order to gain or claim recognition as the creators and not just the silent reproducers of political and intellectual life. So I hope we can continue the conversation with questions, comments, and discussion. Thanks.
That was fascinating, Corinna. Thank you so much. I'm curious, in your research, do you have any idea how the print shops were separated in terms of, like, how many of them were purely job printers, how many of them were producing their own stuff and able to make a living by selling it? I mean, were they able to produce these political tracts and make a living by people just buying their work? Was that possible? And do you have any idea what proportion of the shops, how they broke out?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult to come up with hard numbers about that. For the study of Mexico, we don't have access to complete records, right? That would really allow us to pin that information down. But my sense is that you really had to juggle in order to survive, and that the most successful printers, the ones that have the longest careers and are around for the longest, are the ones who forge political connections with people in power. So patronage is a really important dimension of printers' businesses, having connections to the state, having some kind of contract for official business with the state, or in some cases with the church, was really important for the printers who emerge as the most sort of significant figures. And those are the same people who were able to who doubled as publishers, right? They were the ones who proposed, sometimes would publish novels. They would publish certainly literature in their newspapers, and attempt to do these sort of independent editorial ventures. But it's always a sort of a struggle, like a constant churn. And this was part of what made printers' lives difficult. They had to come up with these strategies to try to present themselves as these independent figures who weren't just partisan, hacks that were taking the cue from their patrons. At the same time, they couldn't necessarily survive without those connections. So there's always this tension. And so they juggled everything. Any printer would have done job printing, and accept also kind of, these kind of political relationships. The idea of someone who was sort of working just off of the things you sell, I think, as a sort of independent editorial person is something that doesn't quite take off. So the struggle that I think that people still grapple with today, right, is the economics, the principles versus the economics were a central defining tension of the 19th century print world as well.
We have a question from Bill Fisher. He says, early in the talk, there was discussion of attempted government regulation of printers and print shops. Wouldn't the regulations themselves or notices of the regulations have been printed by some of the very folks that were the subject of the regulation? And have you found cases of printers purposely undermining the intended message?
That's a great question. Yeah. The regulations to the space in which regulations are taking place is through laws about freedom of the press, which actually changed with almost every administration over the 19th century. In the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century is a moment of a lot of political change. And so you have factions coming in and out of power, and each new group will try to rewrite the press freedom laws. And so, yeah, the printers will publish these laws. And I haven't found, there's not really much leeway to kind of get away with sneaking in, changing the legal text. But governments were very concerned and anxious that their dependence on printers, and actually the national government depends on printers as contractors for all official materials for much of the 19th century, that generated a lot of anxiety among officials. And there were complaints that, printers were publishing the political record in ways that edited out the opposite political perspective. So like the people who wrote if you printed the congressional debates, some printer would omit the information from one side of the political aisle. And so there was a lot of concern that printers would mess with these, if not the laws per se themselves, but with kind of politics in general, right, and information. So there was certainly a lot of, I found one funny case in which somebody tried to create a fake government gazette, like a fake newspaper that was representing the official government's perspective, and as a way to sort of sell copies. And so there was an investigation into this, attempt to defraud the citizens through this fake government gazette. So, there's all sorts of anxiety that goes along with the fact that it was difficult to establish regulations because the world of printing was fast-paced. People were good at evading regulations at the same time that lawmakers were attempting to write them. So it's an interesting, I hope that answers that question.
So are you saying that you kind of saw evidence of a certain amount of spin?
Everything was spin. Like there was there was a lot of claims to objectivity that people make. And this is a world where liberalism is on the rise, and printers kind of have to claim a kind of impartiality in order to speak in the public sphere. But they are all partisan activists at the same time, right? They are in many ways have ideological positions. And part of printers trying to establish their legitimacy as political actors is to convince people that they don't have another agenda. But if you look at some of their activism, in one of my chapters, I explore a printer who publishes this very scandalous French novel as a way to provoke the Catholic Church into taking action against, against the novel, and then creating a sort of print scandal. And at the same time, he in the wake of this scandal, he sort of casts himself as this neutral party who's just trying to work as an artisan and having his rights as a business owner interfered with. But he is also a Republican, a radical activist who is provoking, right, this sort of response as part of a political strategy. So there's this tension, right, that is really always under the surface, or part of the kind of repertoire of politics in the 19th century.
I want to invite people now to unmute themselves and feel free to ask questions.
I see Pablo has his hand up.
Hey, yes. First of all, congratulations for the book. It's so wonderful to be in this party. Congratulations. And I wanted to say that the book cover and the design is just wonderful. Really, it's a really great book as an artifact. So in this same vein, my question for you, because you started your PowerPoint with an image that began with acto de contrición para comenzar, like to start with an act of contrition. Yeah, and then in the first image in the book that we can see, the first example, it says profunda sensación, like profound, deep sensation. So my question to you as a researcher is, how did you engage with the sort of emotional rhetoric that these printers displayed for political reasons, for commercial reasons? I don't know, but so about the style, the rhetorical style, the way of addressing the emotions of the readers.
That's a great question. I mean, there's so much. It's about creating a rational space of debate, and yet the rhetoric is so impassioned, right? And actually, the liberals, if you're sort of talking about liberals versus conservatives, which is, for folks who are not historians of Latin America, we talk about, liberals who represent kind of classical liberalism, right? Ideas about freedom, individual rights, private property, versus conservatives who are associated with upholding the role of the Catholic Church in society, whereas liberals want to kick the church out of state affairs. And liberals, really are excellent at using kind of emotion as part of their strategy to drum up anger about Catholicism and conservatives. So one of the things that I sort of saw in the research as a strategy of these printers and other liberal and radical activists was the way that they appealed to emotion as part of the sort of grammar of political strategy, right? You drum up outrage in order to kind of advance your position. So yeah, and it's very much contrary to the way that lawmakers, call for calm, right? The lawmakers who are trying to regulate this world of printing are always emphasizing how you need, the cooler heads will prevail and the spirit of the law will be used to guide everybody and channel everyone into this rational space of debate, but in the materials themselves. And you can also see, in the materiality of the materials, one of the things that in the second image that I put in the book, Pablo, the people would, officials were ripping these documents off of the walls of the city in order to submit them to officials, right? Yeah, so the cover of the book is actually it's like the palimpsest of 3 different layers of the broadside that get stuck on each other, because you get a sense for the way people are actually using the physical space to try to obliterate each other's positions, right? You slap a broadside on top of somebody else's broadside on top of somebody else's broadside as part of the tactics of doing politics. And officials enter the game when they rip them off and then try to figure out who's responsible. And there's some issues where some cases I studied where you have people acting as detectives. They call in some printers to try to track down who's responsible by analyzing the type and visiting people's printing shops and trying to find the ink on the tympans. Like there's some cases where they find the ink of the controversial broadside still on the tympan, or in the hell box, there's still fragments of the controversial imprint. So the materiality is also part of this world, and tracking it down, right? So there's this, we when we talk about liberalism, we're always talking about the rational, the sphere of reason, but in practice, it's much more, lively.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
And yeah, oh yes.
I was wondering if during your research, have you come across what they call cordeles? These very, sometimes very, not very elaborate publications, but on all sorts of subjects that they're sometimes sold, that were sometimes sold in markets.
Yeah, are you talking like literatura de cordel, these sort of cheap imprints? Yeah, I mean, a lot of the material is ephemeral. And that's actually one of the things that was interesting to me, because when we talk about the history of the book, there's in historical scholarship, there's this field of history of the book, but in Mexico, books are sort of the least interesting thing to study in the 19th century, right? A lot of energy is being channeled into other more ephemeral things because it's cheaper, it's very expensive to produce books, and not a lot of people can afford books. Mm-hmm. Just the paper, paper cost more than any labor that went into the production of these materials, right? The paper is the most expensive thing. Sarah's nodding, yeah, it still is. The paper is, makes it just such a big endeavor that it's not till the late 19th century where people are really investing in big book productions. And so these ephemeral pamphlets and very short broadsides, and then the newspaper is really where stuff gets channeled in terms of politics. So yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that stuff doesn't survive, right? And one of the things that was interesting about doing research was discovering that the state archives are actually a library of these ephemeral materials, because anxious officials were constantly collecting things that they thought were controversial and that they wanted to investigate. And so the political, the archives of the executive branch are just full of these ephemeral items that would otherwise probably have fallen by the wayside of time. And so it's not a place that scholars usually go to investigate the history of printing, because they go to the library, right? But actually the archive is full of all of these materials that were preserved by people in power. And I see some questions in the chat. Did typecasters get involved, or was type being shipped in from Europe? Yeah, so the history of type founding is really interesting, because most, large amounts of type are imported first through Spain, and then after independence from all sorts of places, but especially the United States. As early as the 1820s, Mexican printers are arranging for shipments from New York. But one of the things that's interesting is that printers developed these sort of stopgap methods to found like F's and S's and just a few letters rather than full fonts of type, because they need sort of stopgap measures to fill in the gaps. But most of the most, throughout the 19th century until linotype, really type is imported. And by the second half of the 19th century, the late 19th century, you have type founding companies in New York or in the US like ATF, who are actually actively advertising in Latin America, right, as they begin to expand in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So that's there as well. And yeah, when did Mexico develop national production of paper and type? Yeah, so I guess I kind of answered your question, Paul. Hey, Paul. And yeah, paper is another one that in the 1820s, independent leaders are trying to secure a paper supply because it's a matter of national security, right? How do you advance the nation with printing if you don't have paper? And that's actually something that national officials and printers conflict over or clash over, because the state wants to subsidize the creation of a domestic paper industry, but printers just want to keep importing because it's cheaper and they think it's better quality than locally made products. So there's actually a full, across the whole 19th century, debates that the state always puts import tariffs on paper, but printers want them to lift the import tariffs. So they're always fighting about that. And by the early 20th century, the Mexican government in the Depression era actually creates a state monopoly for paper so that they can underwrite a book production, a book publishing, a newspaper, and the press. And that also ironically gives the state more leverage to dampen criticism in the press because it can withhold paper supply. So it's sort of a double-edged sword that people sort of need state subsidies to operate and also lose a little bit of autonomy with that development. John says, tell us about the horses running the presses. That's my dad or mom. Yeah, well, there's mules. I know that there are mules who powered some of the large printing presses in Mexico's government printing office. So you can also imagine the sort of smell. There's this very unique sound and smellscape of the 19th century print shop. Bleach is the smell of bleach, the smell of ink, obviously, and the machinery, but also mule waste, right, powering the presses. And you can imagine that it's this very kind of gritty and pungent space that elites are sort of coming in and out of, right, because they're, participating in this world of intellectual production, and yet kind of probably horrified by the dirtiness of the business, right, at the same time. And printers are often have anxiety about how to present themselves to the public in relation to that kind of gritty world, a kind of ambivalent relationship to the gritty world of work, because I think of also their desire to be taken seriously as intellectuals, and there's a sort of obsession with cleanliness as well, right? Yeah. So David is curious about foreigners. Hey, David. Oh yeah, sure. So the role of foreigners in the printing business. There are always immigrants in Mexico associated with printing, for sure, either as intermediaries, merchants who sell, who help to bring materials from the US or Europe into Mexico, people who are associated with politics, like cultural, political, I'm not sure the words, like the attachés or the political emissaries, the commercial figures from the US who work in Mexico will sometimes double as printing suppliers. And so, there are all these figures who are immigrants throughout the 19th century who enter the world of Mexican printing, for sure. So, I don't know if Sebring was like this one guy, Cornelius Sebring was an American, I think, who moved to Mexico and set up a press there, but he didn't last super long. People come and go. And so you see them kind of hanging out, but they're not necessarily the major protagonists, I think, of the world, at least of printing politics. Oh, Anna, yeah. Did you encounter evidence of how printers might have helped or hindered feminism? Well, so, it's an interesting question about when you think about Mexico's printing trades comparatively, because I know in the United States, women entered the printing trades as compositors in the 19th century. In Mexico, they're informally barred from the shop floor, right? They really are not welcomed into the trades. And it's not till the late 19th century where these efforts emerged to integrate women through technical education, like vocational schools, where you can learn printing. And the women begin to train in some of these programs and learn about become compositors, but then they don't have anywhere to work, right? They're not really, plugged into the world of the print shop. And the printing shop has its whole lore around that's really gendered. Women are there everywhere, right? They're the wives of printers. They're managing printing businesses along with their spouses. They help when their husbands get sent into exile or thrown into jail. They write to the government and say, please, like, help me out. I'm a poor widow, or I'm a poor wife and I need to run the business. They're servants. They work cleaning the print shop, but they are nowhere to be found in the myths and narratives that the print shop tells about itself, except as the press. The press itself is feminized as like the nurturing partner, or the obedient daughter, or the patron saint, right? There are parallels drawn between the Virgin Mary and the printing press, right? The daughter who is a silent daughter to the printer who's the father and teaches the printing press. I have collected all of this kind of printer poetry and printer writings about the printing press, and it's always feminized, right? So this is sort of the emotional basis for the corporate community is around this masculine sort of sociability, where the press, the only woman who's allowed in is the printing press that gets manhandled. So I definitely think that in the 19th century, women who are associated with, early sort of bourgeois feminist movements are using printing, right? They're commissioning print. So for sure, there are the growth of women's magazines and things like that. But I don't know if helped or hindered is the right word. It's just, these are very, and there are conversations by the 19th century, late 19th century, about whether women should be allowed into the print shop, right? So, it's something that printers are beginning to debate by the time that I end my research. So it's kind of a subtext to their male heroism. Excellent. And Paul's asking, do we have time for any more questions? Or are we almost out of time, I'm guessing?
Sure.
So Paul asked if kind of printer dynasties. Yeah. So the printer dynasties were absolutely central to printing in the colonial era. You have like the 17th century, there's basically one dynasty that controls the entire printing trade that Ken Ward has written about in his dissertation. And there's great dissertations written in Mexico by a couple of my colleagues, Manuel Suarez, Cecilia, I'm forgetting, Ontiveros, is her last name? Ana Cecilia, and they've traced these printer dynasty families in the colonial era, but in the 19th century, they just don't work. What I found is that they don't continue. And every printer who manages to establish themselves as like a notable figure, when they die, their businesses die with them. And I wonder if it's partially because they construct these cults of personality around themselves, or they become these sort of larger than life persona, or because they have successfully propelled their children into a higher social status, right? Their children have become educated and can assume a sort of more privileged position in society. And so they leave the laboring space of the print shop behind. So I'm not really sure on the answer to that, but as to why those dynasties don't hold up. And there's not enough wealth to be made in the printing trades to give rise to figures like you have in the United States, these massive publishing companies, right, that emerge across the 19th century. So that's where the economic context in which all this happens plays a role in shaping the similarities and differences between, cases of printing in the Americas more broadly, or the trajectories of printing. Yeah.
Okay, well, this was so fascinating. I can't wait to get the book. And I hope you'll come visit us more often. And I want to thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And thank you all for joining us. And keep an eye out in the fall because we will start Book Talk again. So take good care, Corinna, and thank you.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. It was really fun. Thanks for the great questions.